to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest Mark Gober, and he's here today to share with us his new book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. Now, Mark is an author whose worldview turned upside down in late 2016 when he was exposed to world-changing science. This science suggested that, contrary to mainstream assumption, consciousness is not produced by the brain. After extensive research, he wrote The End to Upside Down Thinking to introduce the general public to see these cutting-edge ideas, all in an effort to encourage a much-needed global shift in scientific and existential thinking. So let's welcome to the show, Mark Gober.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, what a pleasure it is to have you here and to talk about this book. And my goodness, you've got a lot of information here. It is packed with great stuff.
Thank you. I really wanted to put as much of the best evidence out there into one place for people so that it could be kind of a first stop for people interested in these topics.
Well, and before we go too far ahead here, I'd love for you to share with us, because you're a businessman, so how did you even become inspired to write about this book?
It was not something I had planned on. It came about pretty spontaneously, where I started listening to podcasts around these topics in August of 2016, became very interested, and then started spending basically all of my time outside of the business world focusing on these topics and researching just for my own personal benefit, because I wanted to understand reality better. And there was this whole realm that I had been exposed to that I previously did not know about. So it was a pretty earth-shattering period for me to shift my worldviews in many ways. And because of that, I was just curious to learn. And I did that for about a year with no plans of writing a book. And after that year of research, I had an inkling that I should maybe try to summarize it in a book. And then I said, no, that's going to be too much. And then eventually I decided to do it. It was over a period of a few weeks where I kind of went back and forth in my mind. And I took the 4th of July weekend in 2017. It was a long weekend, 4 days. And I just didn't leave my apartment in San Francisco and decided I was going to sit there and summarize as much as I could of the research I had done. And I ended up getting a lot done over that long weekend. I got more than half of a first draft of the manuscript done, and I had the rest of it laid out. So basically over the next few weekends, I was able to fill in the missing pieces. So again, it started out as just completely personal interest, and then I decided I wanted to share it with people.
Well, I think when most people hear that you wrote a book in a few weekends is stunning, especially this book, because it has so much. It has a lot of information. It's backed up by a lot of studies. So when you're reading it, you really get a good understanding of what's being said.
Thank you for saying that. I think a lot of the writing of the book, though, did come in that year's worth of research, and it had been organized in my mind. The writing of it was just more of a formality of putting the different pieces on paper and having the appropriate citations. But I had kind of been formulating for myself how I thought about the topics and then put it on paper.
Well, and so when we talk about the myth that the brain's producing consciousness, why don't you share with us why that's so important that we're making this distinction?
It's fundamental to our existence. Right now, you and I and anyone listening to this conversation, we all have a consciousness. It's the subjective inner experience of being aware that we all have. So it's the fundamental part of any experience in our life. And yet what I discovered in my research is that science has no clue how this fundamental thing comes about from our brain. And the brain is a physical structure in our body, and our consciousness is not physical, in that right now we're all aware, but we couldn't touch that awareness. It exists, but it's not physical. It's subjective, whereas our brain is physical. And this is the big question in science right now. Science magazine has called it the number 2 question that remains in all of science. How is it that our physical brain creates a non-physical consciousness? And to me, that was a mind-blowing discovery, the idea that this fundamental part of our existence is still not well understood.
Well, and so what are some ways that you were able to determine that that is not the case, that this whole thing that the brain produces consciousness is more of a myth?
There are a number of reasons why that people think the brain produces consciousness, and it is largely, I think the biggest reason is due to the correlation between what happens to our brain and the type of conscious states that we experience. So if someone, let's say, gets in a car accident and has brain damage, that person might have a corresponding memory loss. So we can see we shifted the brain and we shifted consciousness. We can do that in many other cases. And this is what neuroscience spends a lot of time on, is looking at how we change the brain and how it shifts consciousness. The potential problem, and what I would say is a problem based on the research I've done, is that we are tending to assume that because there is such a strong relationship between the brain and consciousness, that the brain must therefore be producing or causing it. And just logically, that is not a conclusion we can make. And I'll give an example from Dr. Bernardo Castro, who I cite a number of times in the book, who says if you imagine that there's a fire and lots of firefighters show up, then you have a larger fire, more firefighters are showing up. So in the case of the fire, there's a strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that are appearing. In that instance, though, we don't say that the firefighters are causing or producing the fire, even though there's that relationship. And that's what most of my book is devoted to, is saying, okay, let's say the brain's not producing consciousness. What is an alternative explanation to explain why the brain is so related to our conscious experience? And there are two analogies that I think were helpful to me when I got into the research. One is to view the brain as being like an antenna receiver for consciousness. So in the same way that if you're watching TV and the antenna gets broken, then maybe the television show that you're watching becomes scratchy on the screen. But it's not because the signal was damaged. The signal came from outside the television set, and the antenna is the processor of consciousness, of the signal for TV. But analogously, it's like the antenna is the brain is the processor for consciousness. Another analogy that I think is actually a bit more precise is to say that the brain is like a filtering mechanism for consciousness, where if consciousness is like the sun, then our brain and our thoughts and our emotions, they're sort of like clouds that block the rays of consciousness. So the brain is actually a limiter to what we perceive. And there are a number of instances in the book that I discuss, such as the near-death experience, where a person has little or no brain functioning, and yet they have an enriched consciousness. There's a pattern of actually reducing what happens to the brain, where we see enrichments in consciousness, which matches this idea of the brain as a filter.
Mm. Well, and so in your experience and with the research that you've done, why do you think that science is kind of behind the curve when it comes to the discussion of consciousness?
I think it's because there is this ingrained assumption that it must be the case that consciousness is a result of complex chemical and electrical reactions that are occurring inside our skull, and they're producing the experience we have. And if we use that as the baseline assumption for the research we do, then it will inherently limit the conclusions we can come to. And that's why I wanted to write, and I did write a whole book, which is hopefully forcing us to look at that assumption, which to me is just often overlooked. It's a foregone conclusion that consciousness is produced by the brain. So why even examine that question? And it was something certainly that I had never even thought to question. I thought we already knew the answer, that consciousness is just a product of the brain, and it's because our brain is complex that it happens. So to me, it's a matter of hopefully opening people up to looking at the assumption and saying, wait a second, it is an assumption that the brain produces consciousness. And given that that's an assumption, why do we think it's true? And are there alternative explanations? And that's what I'm hoping to do.
Do you sometimes feel like an explorer on the edge of the flat world discovering it's round?
It feels very similar to that. And I think throughout history there have been cases of new discoveries where there was a conventional way of thinking, and then it was challenged. People thought that new idea was crazy. So germ theory is a good example, where we used to think it was crazy that little bacteria that we can't see could make us sick and potentially even kill us. And then with the advent of the electron microscope, it became clear that there are little critters that can make you sick and potentially even kill you. So this has happened forever, where something that was once thought to be crazy then becomes the mainstream conventional wisdom. And for me, based on the research that I saw, I was pretty blown away at how much research had been done in many independent areas, all of which point to this notion that consciousness is not produced by the brain. So in some ways I feel like I'm a bit on the frontier of this, but in other ways I don't, because I think many people have been onto this for a long time, and it's, to me, a question of whether we're at the tipping point of finally coming to accept this immense body of research.
Yeah. There's a lot out there, and we're kind of in this era where it's being discussed more commonly. Before they would burn you at the stake or something like that. Maybe you didn't have to talk about stuff like this, but yeah, it's something that's becoming more of a normalized conversation where people can discuss this. It's not some off thing that has already been decided by science.
Yeah, what I've found is that it really depends on who I'm speaking with. Because there's some people I'll talk to about this topic, and it's like they've never heard it before, and it is so radical to them. And then other conversation I'll have, people say, "Oh, we've known this for millennia," and so that's another reason why I felt like the book needed to be written, is that there is an unevenness in how the information has been disseminated, and there are groups of very smart people that have never heard of these things before. So it's many of the beliefs about the brain and consciousness, I think, are due to a lack of knowledge about what data is out there.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, in your book, you talk about Six Sigma, and I would love for you to share what that is.
It's a statistical term that is used to look at the odds that a statistical result is just due to chance alone, or if it's due to a real effect. And Dr. Dean Radin, in his new book called Real Magic, he looks at a number of phenomena that are in the category of psychic abilities. So things like telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens, psychokinesis, which is the ability for mind to affect matter, remote viewing, which is perceiving something at a distance. These are examples of psychic phenomena, all of which I chronicle in my book. And I mentioned that Dean Radin has looked at the statistics for all of these things, and they all achieve the Six Sigma level, which is a highly significant level, basically meaning that the odds that these things are just happening by chance alone is over 1 billion to 1. In other words, in other areas of science, if you get Six Sigma statistical results in studies, those things are accepted as being real. And yet in this psychic arena, even though we have Six Sigma results, according to many scientists, they say we have no evidence. And then yet people like Dean Radin, who have looked at the studies, they show Six Sigma results. And one other thing I should mention about Six Sigma that Dean Radin mentions also is that people have won awards, like the Nobel Prize, for getting even 5 Sigma. The Higgs boson particle, which is a big discovery in physics, that was based on a 5 Sigma statistical result, won the Nobel Prize. And here we are with incredible results suggesting that psychic phenomena are at least real at a subtle level, at Six Sigma levels, and they're going unacknowledged by much of science.
So why is this important when we're having a discussion about consciousness? And this is probably like a really easy question for you, so you have to excuse me. But I'm just trying to break this down for our listeners. So when we talk about consciousness, why is understanding how Six Sigma and psychic phenomenon all come together within it?
The way I have thought about this whole problem of consciousness is that, as we established, there's a question at least as to whether the brain produces consciousness or if the brain is just the processor. And so my approach was to look at a number of phenomena, independent phenomena, which, if any of them are real, we cannot explain them well if we think the brain produces consciousness. However, we can explain them very well if we say that consciousness is non-local to the body and the brain is this processor or filter or antenna. Some of those phenomena are the ones that I mentioned: telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, remote viewing. These are psychic abilities which suggest that the brain is almost picking up consciousness from an external source, or that we are able to tune into a non-local thing using the brain. So it's highly significant that we get Six Sigma results for these psychic abilities, because it suggests that there is some reality to those abilities. And if there's a reality to them, then how can we explain this non-local consciousness idea if we think consciousness is just stuck in the skull? So to me, these are independent areas which I think should push us to consider alternative possibilities of consciousness. Maybe consciousness isn't produced by the brain. And those are just a few of the examples that I discuss in the book.
Mm-hmm. You have a lot of great information in the book. I mean, it's definitely, I'm going to be rereading it because I'm sure I'll gain something else every time I read the book. And what was interesting, you did talk about remote viewing. I think that's a great, people who do remote viewing or mediums is a great example of how consciousness, isn't, confined to the brain. It's they're tapping into something else.
Yes, I agree with you. And remote viewing is to me one of the most fascinating cases. Again, this is the ability to perceive something at a distance so you're not there seeing it physically with your eyes, and yet you're able to see it with your mind, and in some cases even draw out what you're seeing. The U.S. government ran a program for more than 20 years in which they used remote viewers as psychic spies. So that was a real shocker for me to discover. And even more than that, I discovered that the CIA has declassified documents from the Cold War era that talks about how remote viewing is a real phenomenon, and I was able to include those documents in my book. So at least the CIA's documents internally, they're saying that this was a real thing that was used. I also, for my own forthcoming podcast, have interviewed many of the people that are discussed in the book, and one of the people I interviewed is Russell Targ, who ran the U.S. government's remote viewing program out of Stanford University in the early years. And when talking to someone like him, or people that are in this field that see it all the time, to them, there's no doubt as to whether these abilities are real, because they saw it being used all the time. And what he said to me is for people who are not familiar with this area, maybe the best evidence that you can get that this was a real phenomenon that was actually used is that the U.S. government spent more than $20 million over a 20-year period to continue the program, which is indicating that something was being used there.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, and you look at, being able to use that, you hear about other governments doing the same, so there is some value there.
Yes, and my understanding, at least in the Cold War period, is that the U.S. became interested at first because the Soviets were using remote viewing, and the U.S. wanted to have this ability. So there were also cases where it was really critical to have it. In one instance, there was a Soviet bomber that went down in an African jungle that the conventional radar systems could not find. And the U.S. government was able to call on its remote viewers to locate where this thing was, and it had code books and top secret documents. So the U.S. was able to find this downed bomber in the African jungle based on remote viewing. And actually that's something that former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has confirmed.
This is very interesting. And I know in your book you also talk about people who have had near-death experiences, and you touched on that briefly earlier. That there's that sense of, the brain, they can have no brain function. They've passed for a moment, and they have this experience, and sometimes they can even see what's happening in the room when they've coded. It's very interesting just what happens at that point.
It's a really important area of study because it's suggesting that consciousness is existing independently of a functioning body, which again points to this idea that the brain isn't the producer of consciousness, because in these cases the brain is off. So I think the strongest cases are the ones that you were alluding to. They're known as veridical out-of-body experiences. In other words, the person perceives their consciousness as being above or outside of the body, seeing things in the room, but what they're seeing upon being resuscitated is verified as being accurate. So this goes directly against some of the hypotheses that the near-death experience is just a hallucination that the dying brain is causing or producing. Whereas if it were a hallucination, we wouldn't expect people to be giving real accounts. And there have been even some some pretty well-done studies on this. For example, Dr. Sam Parnia in Resuscitation Journal, which is a peer-reviewed medical journal, there was a case of a cardiac arrest patient who was resuscitated. He had a classic near-death experience, and some of the things that he reported when he was just recalling his memories during that period, those things happened at a time when the brain was measured to be off. So they have timestamps of the things that he saw because they were related to some of the medical equipment. So, for example, he heard the noises the defibrillator was making. He described the noises, and they said, oh, wow, that was exactly the noise the defibrillator made, and we know when it made those noises because we have the medical records, and that was during a time at which you should have had no brain functioning, capable of making a memory like that. So when we hear cases like this, it is suggestive that the consciousness is not dependent on the brain, and because of the clarity that's typically experienced, sometimes people talk about having even more logical thought processes than usual, or that things are clearer than usual. It's like the consciousness is enriched when the brain gets out of the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard people tell stories where they have heard conversations of someone, let's say, like outside the hospital on the phone, and they're on the third floor. It's just interesting what happens during that time, what we become aware of, and really how that distinction between the body and the consciousness really, really comes.
Yeah, it becomes non-local. That's often reported where people are seeing things that are even beyond the room. And there are cases that I discussed in the book from an incredible book called Mind Sight. These are cases of people who have been blind since birth or have had some kind of issue with seeing. Sometimes it's just color blindness, but sometimes it's full blindness. And yet in the near-death experience state, they describe the same things that a sighted person sees during a near-death experience. And some of the things that they see are verified as being accurate when they come back into their body. And when they come back into their body, they return to their state of not being able to see.
Wow, it's pretty interesting. Well, I know in your book you also, kind of list what some of the basic elements of NDEs are. And we don't want to go over all of them, but I'd love for you to just share a couple.
I'm glad you said that because to me it's one of the most mind-blowing things that I've learned about. It's a hint into what might happen when we physically die, even though we can't know that for sure because the person obviously didn't actually die because they are resuscitated and come back in their body. But that said, there are things that are often reported in the near-death experience, and these things have been reported throughout the ages, dating back to Plato, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in the last few decades, we've gotten more and more reports of this because our medical technology and our resuscitation technology have gotten so much better. And now we're bringing people back, whereas previously our medicine would not have been able to bring these people back. One of the things that's often described is a feeling of ineffability. And this is critical. Ineffability means that it's difficult to put the experience into words. And I think this is one of the reasons it's been so difficult for people who've had near-death experiences called NDEers. The NDEers have had a hard time conveying their experiences to people is that it's difficult to use language. So if you haven't had that experience, it's hard to relate to an NDEer. And that's almost universally what's discussed is ineffability. But beyond that, people talk about having very positive emotions. They talk about a feeling of unconditional love. They have heightened senses, as I mentioned, where they're sometimes thinking more clearly than usual, but they're also feeling more alert than usual. They have an out-of-body experience. And during that out-of-body experience where they're hovering over their body in the room or elsewhere, there's typically an acknowledgement of being dead. So they realize that something has happened to their physical body, but their consciousness is still functioning. There are descriptions of other realms. Sometimes they're described as heavenly realms, where it's kind of this blissful area where there's a feeling of unconditional love. They talk about a tunnel that they see. They encounter mystical lights or beings or deceased relatives. They talk about how space and time are different. And sometimes they are even given special knowledge or understanding of things that shifts their perspective when they come back. But to me, the most mind-blowing thing, maybe that I've learned of everything, is what's known as the life review that is reported during the near-death experience, where the person is reviewing their life, and they're seeing what happened to their life in a flash, observing how they treated people. And in some cases, they experience those events or re-experience them through the eyes of the people that they affected during those events. And I can give an example from Daniel Brinkley, who I also interviewed for my podcast. He has had 4 near-death experiences. One he was electrocuted to when he was in open-heart surgery, and another one in brain surgery. But he, interestingly, had a life review every single time. And each time he started from the beginning of his life and re-reviewed things, and then whatever was incremental, he reviewed that. That was the new stuff. But for him, he was a Marine in Vietnam, and there were a number of people that he killed. So during the life review, he experienced the deaths of the people that he killed and felt the pain that they went through. But not only that, he experienced the pain of those who were close to the people that he killed. So it was like an indirect experience. He got to see the ripple effect of what he had done. So when he came back into his body, and this is often reported, people's values shift because they see that life seems to be really focused on how we're treating other people and less about materialistic gains. So it's not about what kind of car we drive, it's about how we treated people, and whether it's people close to us or the cashier at the store. And that's I think a really important thing to keep in mind, because it's a life review is a real thing that we're all going to go through. And if you talk to people who've had near-death experiences, they will typically say, look, this is just part of the life process, is that we have a life review. That, I think, could really shift one's perspective about how we're living on a day-to-day basis.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Mark Gober in regards to his new book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed, and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest Mark Gober in regards to his new book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. So Mark, before we went for break, we were talking about life review and that everyone has to go through that and the implications it has. that how people who've had near-death experiences share that every single person goes through a life review. So it's kind of a marker in the road for us to be as kind and compassionate as possible as we can to people now.
Totally. I think that's what it's showing us, and that's what people are experiencing firsthand. What they often talk about is they realize it's not only how they're treating people, but it's the intent behind the treatment. And like you say, it's about being a good person, things that we kind of know innately. Usually in the life review, in the near-death experience, people, when they see they didn't act well towards a person, there's this sense that they knew better deep inside. So it actually brings a sense of personal accountability, which I've heard multiple reactions to this. Some people say that the life review is like a beautiful thing that is teaching us a lot about life. Other people are afraid of it because it brings a sense of personal accountability that we will see how we acted towards people, and we're kind of judging ourselves. We're our own harshest critic.
Well, then if that's the case, then we have the option now to make the right decision, so the life review isn't as scary. When we get to that place, we can make those changes.
That's a great point, and it's something that people who have had near-death experiences often make. They say, look, you don't have to go through cardiac arrest or open heart surgery or something traumatic to have the learnings. Fortunately, we have a lot of learnings from people who've come back from the near-death experience, and we can take what they're bringing and see the consistency across the accounts and say, maybe this is a real thing, and therefore we can act accordingly without having to almost die.
Well, and so let's talk a little bit about people who are psychic mediums or mediums that, speak with spirits that have passed on. I mean, what does that tell us? I mean, we look at that, and some people, they're of the thought process of, this makes sense, I've got it, and other people think it's all, the mediums are looking them up online to find out information before they meet with them.
That's the reaction I often get when I talk to people about mediumship. If they're not familiar with it, it's, haven't mediums been disproven already? Don't we already know that they're using certain tactics? Interestingly, there is an institute called the Windbridge Research Center, which is running studies on mediums that controls for all of the typical explanations that people would use, whether it's things like cold reading. Cold reading is where you just pick up on the cues of the person and you use that to come up with the reading. The studies at the Windbridge Research Center are done over the phone, where the researcher speaks with the medium over the phone and just gives the medium the first name of the deceased person. So the medium doesn't even know whose relative that is. They just know the first name. And so many of the biases that people are typically using as the explanation for how mediumship could be basically a contrived thing, those are controlled for. It's known as quintuple blinding, 5 levels of blinding that they use, whereas many studies are just double blind. They use 5 levels of blinding, and they have shown statistical results in 2 peer-reviewed journal papers where the mediums seem to know things about the dead person just based on the first name beyond what chance would predict.
And it really has people kind of pause and take a step then. I know a lot of times when mediums are meeting with people, they'll do things where they tell them something that only they specifically will know.
Right. They know very specific information sometimes. That's another important point. I've heard the argument, well, if they're not 100% right, then they're fraudulent. And I think that is maybe a misinterpretation of how these abilities seem to work. It's not whether people are 100% accurate. It's whether they are accurate beyond what chance would predict. That means there's some kind of transference of information that is not conventionally explained. Whether it's something so specific like you mentioned or something more subtle, we have to be able to account for something that would be an anomaly beyond chance. And that's what seems to be happening over and over again, is that there are these anomalies that we would not predict based on the conventional models. And mediumship to me is one example of that, additional example of that.
Well, and I know in your book you talk about pets and how they seem to have like this sixth sense when we're going to be coming back or things are going on. And it's interesting just how like dot on these animals are.
It is amazing in some cases. The research in this area has been somewhat limited beyond many pet owners who report these things. But Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has courageously, I think, decided to look at these things in a controlled manner. The strongest cases, to me, are instances where dogs seem to know that their owners are coming home. And there was one pair of dog owner and dog, Pam and JT is the name of the dog, that Dr. Rupert Sheldrake studied, where he would send Pam off miles away from home in a cab. So what he's trying to do is control for many of the conventional explanations, which is, well, yeah, the dog knows when the owner's coming home because the dog knows that the owner comes home at this time, or the dog can hear the sound of the car, or many things like that. So he has the owner go far away, miles away, where we can't say that it's sound or smell. It's not even in the owner's car. It's at a random time. And the owner doesn't even know when she's coming back. Pam is told at a random time, okay, it's time for you to go in the cab and drive back home in the cab. And what they see when they have video cameras on both Pam and the dog at home is that the dog seems to go to the window more often when she is on her way home. And actually, there are videos on Dr. Sheldrake's website where you see that Pam is deciding that she's going to go home. She's told it's time. She starts walking to the taxi, and then the dog starts going to the window. So it's like the dog is picking up on the intent. It's like a telepathic communication.
That would make sense. I mean, my dog used to do the same thing. So every time I come back, he's like at the window, and I would watch him because I had cameras at home. So I'd watch him during the day to see how he was doing. And then as I'm coming home, and it was different times, he would be ready. He'd be at the window waiting, you know.
People often report this, yeah. And I would love to see more studies on it. It's nice that Dr. Sheldrake found a few pairs of owners and dogs. I think there are probably more instances than we realize. It's just not studied very much.
Yeah, it's just how that link, well, which kind of brings me to my next topic I want to chat with you about, telepathy, you know, because it seems to be that when we talk about that connection people have with their pets, you know, people can, in you know, as far as telepathy is concerned, you know, there's that sense as well. Yeah,
I mean, the reason I included a chapter on animals is that it's something that many people relate to, and there is research on this with animals, but we see these same effects in humans. So to me, the notion that animals, which also have brains, that they could do these things too, that just seems like a logical follow-on. When we talk about telepathy as studied in humans, the best study in terms of statistics is known as the Gansfeld experiment. And the basic design is as follows. You have one person in a room, we'll call him Bob, and he's put into a very relaxed state. You have another person in another room named Jane, and Jane is shown by the experimenters pictures or movie clips or something visual. She's told to try to mentally send what she sees over to Bob in the other room. And Bob doesn't know what she's looking at. Jane and Bob don't even know each other, and they don't have any claims of being ultra-psychic. Like at the U.S. government with remote viewing, those were kind of the superstars, like the Michael Jordans, if we think of psychic abilities as being on a distribution. You have some people that are outliers of being really good, and then you have the general public. These people in the Gansfeld experiment studies, these are just average people that don't have any special claims. So Jane follows the instructions, and she says, okay, even though I don't claim to have any abilities, I'm going to try to mentally send what I'm seeing to Bob in the other room. Bob, at the end of the period, is shown 4 pictures, one of which Jane was looking at and allegedly mentally sending to her. And he's asked to pick which of the 4 was Jane sending to you, even though he's never seen it before. Chance would predict, if there were no effect, that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, or 25%. However, what the experimenters find when you combine the data from many experimenters over many decades is that it's closer to 32% that Bob is correct. So that deviation versus the 25% that you'd predict by chance, when we look at statistics going back to Six Sigma, it's at that level where the odds that this is just a chance occurrence is more than 1 billion to 1. In other words, there is some effect, even if it's a small effect, it is a real effect that statistics is picking up, which our current science is not accounting for.
Well, that's something to pay attention to. So when you hear that, then it's like, okay, you know, we've got stats here that are telling us something that we really need to look at, because if it's just by chance, I mean, it wouldn't even register.
If it were just chance, we would see the number approaching 25% over and over again. And yet it's not. It is approaching a higher number. which suggests that some information, even if it's subtle, is transferring between Jane to Bob mentally. And to me, it actually, that result makes sense, because in our daily lives, most of us at least are not fully telepathic. We don't know what everyone else is thinking. But we do have instances sometimes where we think of a person and then we get a text and it's not someone we've thought about in a long time. And it's like, wait, was that a chance occurrence or was I picking something up? And so I think many of us have these experiences that we can write off as chance occurrences. But when we look in the lab and we see this slight deviation from chance, we might be able to explain some of those daily occurrences as being subtle telepathic events.
Well, it'll be interesting. You can either think, am I picking something up or am I causing it?
That's a good point. I think for any given instance, it's hard to know what is at play. But in these studies, they're isolating the variables pretty well. And the only thing that's changing is that the person is either sending the mental intention or what they're seeing or not. And we're seeing a deviation from chance based on the person mentally sending something. And to me, when you combine it with all the other information, it's suggesting again that consciousness is transferring from one to the other, which matches this idea that consciousness is not localized to the body.
It's a good thing my dog couldn't do that, because he'd have me buying chicken for him all the time, But you look at this, and a lot of this cannot just be explained away. So when you look at what's happening and the connections that people are making, there's something there, and that's why science. We have different scientists that are doing the research and doing the work to uncover how these things are connecting. How are we connected together?
Yeah, I'm glad that scientists are looking at it, and it's coming from a number of different places. So we've talked about psychic abilities and near-death experience and mediumship, but also the underpinning of reality, which is quantum mechanics. That is also pointing in this direction too. There's a phenomenon known as entanglement, where you have two particles. One is here, one's far away, so they're physically distant. When you affect one, the other one that's far away mirrors it at the same instance. So you affect one, the other one's affected at the same exact time, which suggests that there is a hidden connection because there's no time that has lapsed, and yet these two things are simultaneously reacting. So Albert Einstein did not like this because he thought the speed of light was the fastest that anything could travel. He called this spooky action at a distance, and in fact tried to disprove entanglement because it went against his theory of the speed of light. So in trying to disprove it, he ended up further proving that entanglement is a real thing, and that has been confirmed over and over again. So we see in physics that there are non-local connections, and it's led many people to say maybe this is related to the anomalies that are accumulating, whether it's telepathy or otherwise. And we've seen people like Dr. Gene Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He wrote a book called Entangled Minds, which gets to this idea that maybe we are part of an interconnected consciousness that explains telepathy. And then there are people like Brian Josephson. He's won a Nobel Prize in physics. And he has said he thinks that telepathy is real, and he thinks that quantum mechanics might help us explain how it works.
Well, hopefully that happens within our lifetime, because I think that would be kind of exciting to see that bridge happen, with science kind of getting into that kind of spiritual realm,
I hope so. And I'm somewhat new to the space relative to many of the other scientists who have been doing this for decades. It's interesting when I ask them about that exact issue that you mentioned, about when do we think a shift will happen, given that there's such an accumulation of new evidence that seems to be really strong. And for me, it depends on who I speak to. Some people are pretty pessimistic because they've seen all the evidence accumulate throughout the decades. And to them, this stuff should have been proven a long time ago, and yet it's still considered out there science. So that, to them, they think it's going to take a really long time before these things are accepted as being real. And other people are more optimistic, where they say that we're getting such strong evidence. One example that I think is very significant and makes me more optimistic is that the American Psychologist Journal, which is the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Psychological Association, in 2018 published an article that looks at the statistics for those same psychic phenomena we discussed earlier that have Six Sigma results. And the American Psychologist Journal accepted the article, and the article talks about how these things are real phenomena at least based on the statistics, if we compare the statistics there to the statistics that we see in other areas of science, like psychology. So that is, to me, is a really positive thing, that a mainstream journal is accepting these findings and allowing to publish them. And I'll give you a quote from that journal. This is the article was by Dr. Etzel Cardenia at Lund University. He says, direct quote, "The evidence provides cumulative support for the reality of psychic phenomena, which cannot be readily explained away by the quality of the studies, fraud, selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence, or other frequent criticisms. The evidence is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines." Again, that's in a mainstream journal from the American Psychological Association. That, to me, is reason for optimism.
That is very optimistic when you look at that, because when they do look at the findings, I mean, from a science point of view, science is science, and they look at, they want to look at cause and effect. So there they go.
Yeah, it's right there. And it will be interesting for me to see, for all of us to see how the scientific community reacts to that. And I don't know if it's gotten a lot of attention yet because it's a single article, but it's important because it aggregates decades of research. And much of this research, as you talk to scientists about it, they say, well, all of that stuff's fraudulent and it's been disproven. There's no evidence for psychic abilities or ESP, and that's already been disproven. And yet here we have someone who is accumulating all that data, and a conventional mainstream journal is accepting the findings and publishing it.
Yeah, I want to touch on another thing that you talk about in your book in regards to past lives and children. And it's really, I found that really fascinating when we talk about how children are born and they claim that they've had these experiences, and a lot of them have been proven.
Yes. And these are studied at the University of Virginia and other places, but I found that people are shocked to know that UVA has had a program for more than 50 years. And it's called the Division of Perceptual Studies at the med school there, where they've looked at over 2,500 cases of children who are usually between the ages of 2 and 5 years old, who start spontaneously describing a life that is not theirs. And the details that they give, in some cases, are so specific that the researchers can use historical or medical records to find the exact person that the child is describing. And yet the child is describing those memories as if it were the child's. So it's as if consciousness is transferring from one life to the other. And the researchers who have looked at this think it is suggestive of reincarnation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk about an example in your book about a young girl with a rope.
Yes, and so there are some cases where what is transferred from one life to the other, apparently, is not just a memory or a preference, but it's also a physical manifestation. They can be birthmarks or physical defects and deformities. There's a case that I use in the book from Dr. Ian Stevenson, formerly of the University of Virginia, who found one of his cases of a girl who had been describes being tied up in ropes in a previous life and being tortured to death and actually died. And there's a picture of this girl in her current life, and her leg has indentations as if it were constricted by a rope, but there's no rope there. It's the natural shape of her leg. So her leg has a deformity that matches this alleged previous life where she died in that manner. And in fact, there was a person that died in the manner described by this girl.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking to hear, but also stunning that those accounts match up, and that somebody would be able to articulate that at a young age, and the research is done to find who that person is.
It's incredible, and it's very difficult to explain unless we rethink consciousness. And it even goes beyond that. When we think about medicine more broadly, the conventional thinking is that our body and our physical form is affected by genetics and by our environment. And here we have something that is not genetic and not environmental that is affecting the physical form of the body. So the researchers at UVA, they call it a potential third factor. So imagine if there is a third factor in medicine that we are currently ignoring completely. I mean, who knows what kinds of changes we could see in medicine if we understood that other factor better.
I think there would be very dramatic changes, if we had doctors that were also focused on this spiritual, their consciousness.
I agree. Right now, it's a very materialist or physicalist way of thinking, and that is the idea that everything comes from matter, including consciousness, and consciousness just comes out of the brain, has no effect on the physical world, has no effect on the body in that way. And here, for many examples, whether it's children with past life memories or the chapter I have on psychokinesis, where the mind seems to have an effect on matter, that puts into question some of those assumptions. So if mind or consciousness is affecting matter, then we have to think about the effect on the body and think about alternative ways of treating illnesses.
I know you mentioned earlier that there was a part of research that really surprised you when we were talking about NDEs. Was there anything that really shocked you as you were doing your research for this book?
So much of it. I mean, basically everything that is in that book. It was something that totally surprised me when I was doing the research. I couldn't believe that it was something that had been shown by researchers, and I had never heard of it before. And I think that's actually one of the counters that people will give, which is that, wait, if these things were real and they're so extraordinary, then I would have known about them already. I think for many reasons it's kind of been swept under the rug. Maybe the U.S. government program and the fact that there are declassified CIA documents which very explicitly say that these phenomena are real, that was shocking in that it was so explicit. And one of the quotes from the documents that I show from the CIA in my book, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. That's what it says.
That is true. When there are people that are really gifted at doing that type of stuff, and so it's really interesting when you look at that, and then to have a government say, "Oh yeah, this is a real thing. We think it's valid. We're even putting money behind it." It says a lot.
I think so. And when we put it together with all the other independent areas, they converge to question the assumption that the brain produces consciousness, and they can all be explained if we view consciousness as being this fundamental aspect of reality, sort of like is described by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who says that all of reality is like a stream of water, where water is consciousness. Each of us is a whirlpool within that stream, meaning that we're made of water, i.e. consciousness, but we have individual localized experiences because there are these perceived boundaries. However, we're all connected as part of the same stream of consciousness, so consciousness is effectively everywhere at once, and that might explain all of these phenomena.
That's a really great description. I love that. Because it puts it where you can really visualize, like, hey, I'm still an individual, but I'm connected to everything.
Right. And our eyes and our ears and our sensory perceptual systems, they give us the perception of being an individual. That's the interpretation we give to what we see through our body. And so that is part that has to be explained because we have that perception, and we can explain it through the localized whirlpool. And yet we have these other phenomena that are described, whether it's a near-death experience where people they're talking about other realms. It's sort of like there's this much broader stream out there. Our brain and our body, they limit what we perceive so we don't see the broader stream. However, it still exists.
My goodness. So when we look at all this information, we barely touch the tip of the iceberg on this. I mean, there's so much information in your book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. When we look at that, what is the implications for our daily life?
Well, if we think about the whirlpool analogy, if there's a whirlpool that stops being a whirlpool, in other words, it kind of delocalizes, the water flows back into the stream. It doesn't leave the stream. It just transitions into a new form, which suggests along the lines of mediumship and near-death experiences and children with past life memories, it's all the same implication, which is that when our body dies, our consciousness doesn't die. It just transitions into a new form. And that to me was a groundbreaking idea because I had always assumed that consciousness came from the brain, and when the brain dies, then that's the end of consciousness. There are no memories, no feelings, because they all come from the brain. So how can you have a consciousness when your body dies? This model that we're talking about predicts that consciousness survives when the body dies. And that has huge implications for how we think about our own life in the context of this much broader reality. And I think it could impact how we think about death and whether we should actually fear it in the way that I think we are maybe taught to fear it. I think there's an implicit fear in the materialist idea that the brain produces consciousness because it says that you have a fixed period You better get in as much as you can because it's going to be over. Whereas this model says that consciousness continues well beyond the body.
And I think that provides a lot of people hope when they realize that consciousness does go beyond the body, that can be something, based on what people choose to believe. But, it is it's something that's being proven, and, there's information here to back that. So it kind of gives them a new way of thinking.
I think so. Yeah, for me, it certainly did, and I wanted to make that information accessible to people because it can be a life-changing idea. It really, for me, shifted so much. But there's another idea that's related to this, which is that we're all interconnected as part of the same stream of consciousness, or if you want to use the term entanglement, we're all entangled. The idea is that we're not as separate as we seem to be. That, to me, has big implications as well, and it goes back to the life review, where we seem to be judging ourselves in this altered state with regard to how we treat other people. Because if we're all connected as part of the same stream of consciousness, then doing good things to others is only rational because we're all the same self, just manifesting as this apparent diversity. And this is why Erwin Schrödinger, the famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he said, in truth, there is only one mind. And that's really this idea. There's one stream of consciousness that we're all a part of, even though we have the appearance of separation.
Well, you explained that beautifully because I've heard that before, but not explained in the way, and sometimes you just have to hear it different ways until it clicks. But the way you explained it really kind of makes everything come together. It's like, oh, of course, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it as well. And it takes time. It really takes some thinking because it's an abstract idea. Our eyes show us something different than that. And unless you've had a near-death experience or some other altered state of consciousness that allows you to feel that interconnectedness, it can become a difficult exercise intellectually to think about the interconnectedness. And so it takes some time to say, okay, we have the findings from quantum physics, we have findings from these other areas, we see the life review, etc., and it all converges towards this interconnectivity. And if that's the reality, then how might we act in the world towards others?
Well, it's very important to ask those questions, and your book has so much great information for anyone that's looking for a place to start and really gain just an understanding of consciousness and our lives. I think it's a fabulous bookmark. You did a beautiful job.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, and so where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
My website, which is my name, markgober.com, markgober.com, that has more information on me and my book and my podcast. My book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, is also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other bookstores, but also Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can find me there.
All those great places. Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's been such a privilege to have you here to talk about your new book, An End to Upside Down Thinking. If you'd like to connect with Mark, you can at his website, markgober.com, and we'll have the link below. His book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Mary Ann. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Mary Ann airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.